Hello everybody. So this lesson is an introduction to English language paper 2 question 5 and we're going to talk about what is expected in that question, what the mark scheme is, and then some of the things that we need to start thinking about before we start writing. So paper 2 is all about viewpoint and perspective. Viewpoint and perspective in question 1 to 4, the reading part of the paper, will ask you about the writer's opinions and perspectives and how they convey them in their writing. And section B, which is the writing section, question 5, asks you to convey a certain viewpoint or argument through your own piece of writing. So what are you going to be marked on? So there's 40 marks in all, and it's divided between content and organisation. That's out of 24 in total, and technical accuracy, which is out of 16 in total. It's exactly the same way that the marks are divided up in paper 1 question 5. So the content and organisation section of the paper. What you're being marked on, I've taken this from the highest band of the mark scheme. So what you're going to be marked on is your communication skills. Your argument or your persuasive piece needs to be convincing and compelling. So in other words, it needs to feel like you really believe what you're saying. And compelling means the reader really wants to read, keep on reading. They don't lose interest. The tone, style and register needs to be matched to purpose and audience. That just means that the words that you're using, the style of your writing, needs to be right for the audience that you're writing for. So if you're writing for adults in a broadsheet newspaper, it needs to be standard English, it needs to be fairly sophisticated, etc., etc. It needs to be right for the audience. If you are writing for young people your age, the way that you write might be slightly different. So that needs to be right according to the piece that you're writing and the question that's been set for you. You also need to be using an extensive and ambitious vocabulary. What that means is you're using interesting words, and the words that you're using, you've chosen to have a particular effect. And so you need to be showing that you're thinking very carefully about the words that you place in your piece of writing, and every word that you use kind of has to earn its place. And finally, it says you have to craft your linguistic devices. What tends to happen on this paper is that people rely too much on linguistic devices. They scatter them in all over the place willy-nilly without really thinking about why they're using them. But actually, you get more marks if you use fewer, but you place them carefully. You're really thinking about the effect that they might have. So to continue with the content and organisation marks, you also need to vary your use of structural features. So structural features in this case will be something to do with, it's not like structure in a poem, but it will be to do with things like, do you use bullet points? How do you structure your paragraphs? Are you using columns? How are you making your piece of writing stand out on the page? And you need to be inventive with how you use them, so that you might use numbers, for example. You might do a countdown or something like that. So you've got to think about what's going to work for the piece of writing that you're actually writing. So what's the purpose of it, and do the structural features that you use actually fit with the purpose of that piece of writing? It says your writing needs to be compelling, well, we've seen that already, and to incorporate a range of convincing and complex ideas. And the most important thing there is that it's a range of ideas. So you can't just have one argument and leave it at that and just go on and on and on about that. You've got to have a range of ideas, because you've got to think that you're trying to convince somebody that has a different viewpoint. They're not going to be convinced just by one argument. You need to present them with a range of evidence in order to change their minds and to get them thinking the way that you're thinking or pretending to think. And finally, your paragraphs need to be linked by using discourse markers, and that just means the way that you start your paragraphs. So you might start a paragraph, for example, with on the other hand. That's a discourse marker. So it's just marking the fact that you're going to be talking about a different point of view, for example. So it's telling the reader the kind of thing that they might expect in the paragraph that's coming up. Now the marks for technical accuracy, remember they're out of 16 in total. Your sentence demarcation needs to be secure and accurate. In other words, you need to be using the way that you start and end your sentences needs to work grammatically. So the beginnings and ends of sentences need to be correct. You need to be using punctuation accurately, and it needs to be a wide range of punctuation. So not just full stops, commas, and capital letters. You've got to be using dashes and colons, semicolons, parentheses or brackets, speech marks, and you need to be using them in the right way. You need to use a range of appropriate sentence forms. So might mean that you start your sentences in a particular way. So you might start with an adverb, you might start with an adjective, you might have a short sentence or a longer sentence. You might have a very complex sentence that's got lots of subclauses in it. And you need to be using those accurately, and you need to be thinking about why you're using them. So what effect are you having in choosing to use that particular sentence form? You need to use standard English. In other words, that just means don't use slang. And you need to have a high level of accuracy in spelling. So you do need to try and make sure that the words that you're using, if you're trying to use a complex and ambitious vocabulary, that you know how to spell those words. Okay, so over the years then, what have we seen that means that students tend to not do so well on this question? What puts their marks in jeopardy? Well, when students rely too much on the persuasive devices that they've used or the persuasive techniques, so for example, rule of three or repetition, they tend to just scatter them all over their piece of writing, and they rely on those to try and convince rather than the argument itself. That's a big mistake. Your piece of writing is like a cake. So, but the argument is the cake. The ingredients of the argument are the cake. It's the important thing, and the persuasive techniques are really just the icing on that cake. So it's the argument that matters more than anything else. So we really need to focus on the argument. The next thing students tend to get wrong is that they tend to write too much. So they write themselves into trouble. So they have a few good ideas, but they keep writing because they think they need pages and pages of writing. And they lose control of their writing, which means that they tend to lose marks. And what's really important is the cake, though. It's your argument, basically, that's the important thing. Okay, so what do you need to do? Well, your argument needs to be really solid. So you really need to have thought about those variety of points that you want to make in order to convince someone, bring them round to your point of view. You need to have the capacity to interest and convince someone. So you need to be able to sort of invest a degree of commitment to what you're writing. And it needs to contain a variety of points and not just one, so that you've got a development of your argument. Only once we've practiced getting those points down on paper and having a good number of them will we begin to fine-tune them and apply techniques, because the techniques, remember, the icing on the cake, and we need to use those techniques in order to create a pleasing structure and organisation, but actually it's getting the ideas in the first place that can be more difficult. We're going to have a practice now at jotting down some ideas. So let's say that next week, I'm sure the government are going to make an announcement about how we're going to slowly come out of lockdown next week. And imagine that as part of that announcement, the government said that Year 10 were coming back to school on the 1st of June. I want you to think about all the possible arguments in favour of that. So coming back to school on the 1st of June, and just jot them down. So I'm sure you've come up with loads of arguments now, but here are some of the ones that I could quickly come up with. One argument might be that students should come back to school on the 1st of June because, just for their education, because students are falling behind because they've just not been in the classroom. Another argument might be that there's an inequality in what's happening now. So there's an inequality because we're having to be so heavily reliant on technology, and some students have more technology and more capacity to access technology than others. Therefore, the current situation discriminates and is much more difficult for some, particularly those in bigger families, for example, than for others. Another argument might be that it's just simply going to be healthy for young people to get back into some form of normality. It's been 5 or 6 weeks now, and we're all suffering from not seeing the people that we want to see and not having enough variety in our lives. So it would just be healthy for people to start to get back into some form of normality. It'd be good for young people to socialise, be good for their emotional health and their mental health. So that would be another positive reason for getting children back into school. Another argument might be that sending students to school will just allow more parents to go back to work, and that will start to get the country back onto its feet, and will help with the economy, which must have been hard hit. Another argument might be that the death rate is falling now, and then we're over the peak of this virus, and therefore the NHS can cope. And finally, we might argue that because children are relatively unaffected by this virus, we're not risking their health by sending them into school. So for the purposes of our piece of writing, we might want to think about the possible arguments against. We might want to do that because we might choose to present one or two of the counter arguments in our piece of writing, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it is good to have thought about some of them, just in case we might want to argue against the whatever statement you're given for the piece of writing anyway. So some of the arguments against sending children back on the 1st of June might be that the reinfection rate might rise if children carry the virus and they infect their family when they return home, and therefore we'll have a reinfection rate of more than 1, which the health service will find difficult to deal with. Another argument might be that, while some people say, oh, it's terrible, children are falling behind, well, if all students across the country are in the same boat, which they are because no schools are open, no one's really falling behind. In addition, it's possible that the exam structure can be changed so that there's no disadvantage. You're just examined on slightly less because you've been able to cover slightly less. Another argument against sending children back on the 1st of June could be that there are definitely going to be staff shortages in schools because some staff will continue to get sick, and some staff are in vulnerable groups and they still won't be able to come to work. Another argument against is that some students, in terms of their emotional well-being, are still processing the impact of the current situation, particularly if they've had bereavements, and it would be too much to ask them to return to the normality of school expectations, which, although we get very used to them after a long period away, they're quite difficult to get back into the rhythm of. And the final thing possibly to say against the idea of children going back on the 1st of June is that it will obviously be necessary to maintain social distancing within the school environment, and that will have to take place for some time, and that is simply impossible in a busy school environment with narrow corridors. It's very, very difficult to keep 2 meters apart in that kind of a situation. Once you've decided what the various different arguments for or against might be, you need to decide which side of the fence you want to come down on. So do you want to be for the statement or the idea or against it? And that, whatever that is, for or against, that will be the main body of your writing. You're not going to veer between one and the other. You've got to come down on one side. Otherwise, your writing tends to, when children do that, when they can't decide whether they're for or against, or they veer between the two in a piece of writing, it's an unsuccessful piece of writing. So you really need to decide, are you for or are you against? And the idea is to build up your argument so that it's difficult for the reader to disagree with you. You want to bring them round to your point of view. And you might be pretending what your point of view is for the purposes of the piece of writing, but that doesn't matter. The idea is for that moment while you're writing it, you fully commit to it. And nobody will be able to tell that you maybe don't really agree with what you're saying. Sometimes you might decide to acknowledge some of the counter arguments at some point, somewhere in the middle of your essay. Sometimes it's better to practice without doing that first. But if you did acknowledge some of the counter arguments, you must show why they're not as valid as the points that you've made which support your point of view, because you don't want to leave somebody with any wriggle room where they can say, yeah, I was kind of going along with what they were arguing, but then when they said that thing about why it might not be a good idea, I came round, I really decided that that's what I believed in. So you don't want that. You want them to agree with you. And finally, at the end, you must find a way to end strongly. You've got to convincingly hammer your point of view home so that the reader is left thinking, yeah, I don't know why I ever thought anything different. Of course, that's the right thing. Now, we're going to have a look at an example of a piece of writing which conveys someone's opinion or viewpoint. And I want you to think about what it is that makes this particular piece so successful. Now on here, I'm going to read the article to you, but it should be connected to your assignments piece so that you can read it for yourself. So the article is the title is Dear Katie Hopkins, Stop Making Life Harder for Disabled People, and it's written by Lucy Hawking, who is the daughter of Stephen Hawking. Dear Katie Hopkins, I'm writing to you, not respectfully, but politely, to ask you to stop. I read your comments about Ed Miliband and his supposed resemblance to someone on the spectrum just as I got home from a trip to Australia. I was there as one of the presenters of a show which featured my father, Stephen Hawking. I'm going to assume you know who he is. As a live hologram beamed into Sydney Opera House. In my introduction to him, I said that I hoped attitudes to disability had changed since I was a child in the 1970s, when having a disabled father was a rarity. We were openly and intrusively commented on when we went out together. We had many difficult moments, such as the time a restaurant manager asked us to leave while we were in the middle of lunch because we were putting the other diners off their food. In fact, it was like growing up with a whole world of people like you, everywhere, all of the time. The point of my story at the talk in Sydney was that I hoped that now no disabled person would encounter this kind of behaviour, and that they would be treated with respect and dignity. It's on YouTube. You can watch it and see how the audience responds. And then I read with great sadness your jokes. Are they jokes? I don't even know. About Ed Miliband. When someone with your public profile tells others it's okay to mock people with disabilities, you cause great damage. I have an autistic son. He's very sweet, polite, hard-working, kind, and generally lovely. But yes, he does stare at people from time to time. When we're on the tube, occasionally I have to say to a member of the public that my son is autistic and that I'm sorry he's staring. The reaction is always kind and compassionate. But if he was staring at you, I presume it wouldn't be okay, that you would make a laughingstock out of him. You would use his disability against him, and you wouldn't care how embarrassed, hurt or distressed he was, because it wouldn't matter to you. Don't you think kids with autism have enough to deal with already? Don't you think that they already face enough rejection and social isolation with you making it worse? Do you really think that they need you to tell them that they don't fit into society? And when someone with your public profile tells others that it's okay to mock people with disabilities, you cause enormous damage. The little work I've done with child carers of disabled parents shows what a vulnerable group they are, already regularly bullied and taunted by their peers. It just takes a figure like you to validate the bully's point of view, and who knows how terrible the outcomes could be. There are lots of kids out there with disabled parents or siblings whose lives just got harder because of you. I don't know what you're paid to express such unreserved and trenchant views, but it surely cannot be enough. Soon, the media spotlight will move on, and your planned obsolescence, planned by media companies, not by you, will kick in. At which point, you will be left with no viable career and a backwash of hatred of a staggering acidity and volume. To be honest, I don't really care what happens to you, but I do care what happens to people with disabilities and their families, and I care that you are making difficult lives even more challenging. Please stop. I think some of the things that make that such a successful piece of writing is that you can feel how angry she is. It's really personal. She feels very strongly and she creates a really compelling argument. It's difficult for a reasonable human being to disagree with her point. She doesn't include a counter argument, so you can see that it's perfectly legitimate to write an opinion piece or an argumentative piece or a persuasive piece without including a counter argument. So if you ever think that you're going to get tripped up by putting a counter argument in, you don't have to put it in. And I think in this particular case, the fact that she doesn't have a counter argument perhaps suggests that she believes that there cannot be a counter argument to what she says, and that has the effect of making her piece even more convincing. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this introduction. Next week we're going to look at that particular argument again, the opinion piece that we've just looked at. We're going to look at it again and we're going to sort of dissect it a little bit more in terms of technique. So what I want you to do, ready for next Monday, because this coming Friday is a bank holiday, so that we won't have a lesson on Friday. So for the following Monday, you're going to read the article again. I want you just very simply to identify all the different punctuation that she's used. And the second thing I want you to do is, for yourselves, ready for the lesson next Monday, see if you can identify some of the ways she presents her argument. Okay, have a lovely week.